Hi, this is Lenny Cameron, and today I'm here with a publisher sister, meaning someone whose book is with the same publisher as my own, the Wild Rose Press, which is kind of fun to interview someone with the Wild Rose Press, writing women's fiction like myself.
Right.
Margaret Ann Spence, thank you for joining me today.
Well, Lainey, it's such a thrill. It's delightful to meet you sort of online and to know that we're publishing sisters with this lovely press. I really enjoyed the publishing journey with them and to talk about our books, my book, and I love your book too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, this one's really interesting. Joyous Lies is kind of like a little bit of a mystery. It takes you back to the Vietnam years. It's all around the history of what happened in a commune that your main character kind of grew up in.
Right.
And I found it as a Northern Californian. I even have a little bit of a connection that my hubby grew up in a kind of an intentional community,
Really?
commune, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I found it all very fascinating to read about the commune life mixed in with a good dose of mystery in Joyous Lies. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the book, if you don't mind? Like tell those who haven't read it yet, what might they want to know about this book?
The first character in the book is Mayel, who is a 25-year-old botanist. She's doing her PhD in studying plant communication, which sounds ridiculous because we think plants are just sitting there growing their leaves and so on. But actually, there's a lot going on beneath the ground, and they are communicating. And people now believe they possibly have senses like hearing and possibly even a smell sense, and it's quite amazing. And so that started me off. That really fascinated me.
And that's true. That's not something you made up for the book. That's actually
true.
I wondered. Okay.
In fact, when I sent the book to the Wild Rose Press, my editor said, how can you prove this? And so I sent her a whole file of all the scientific stuff that I'd read. Not that I'm a scientist, it's just the popular science stuff. And this is very hot right now, this topic. Anyway, I wanted to put Miles somewhere, so she had to come from Northern California because that's the place where they do this sort of stuff. And then I had this character, her grandmother came into my mind, Joanna, and she's a 70-year-old ex-hippie. Oh, she's a hippie. And she and her partner and some friends went up to this land in the 1970s so that the guys could escape the Vietnam War draft. Now, as you may tell from my photograph, I am of that generation, and that was our war, and we resisted it. I was never a hippie, but I knew a lot of people who did resist the war. I also knew people who'd gone into communes, not that I've ever done it myself. But it's fascinating. And in the story, a photographer comes to the commune to find out. She asks what became of the hippies, which led me down a rabbit hole of research. And I learned a lot. I read every memoir of hippies that I could find, not many. And then I realized that this era has not been explored very well. And I thought, well, that's actually very interesting, isn't it? And because so many ideas that we take for granted today, Lainey, come out of that period. For example.
Yeah, like I loved, like in this book, some of the stuff around organic farming and a lot of this, I was like, oh, I didn't realize that came from that
the environmental movement, we just celebrated 50 years of Earth Day. And so that it all came from, I think, from this era. And then other things too. And I mentioned the women's movement in there and how the hippies actually missed it because they were up in the boondocks and they didn't sort of notice. And so the women were kind of oppressed up there, which is actually another interesting thread I wanted to explore.
And you're making me wonder, where are you joining us from today? Like, are you in California or did you have to learn about the location? Like,
actually, I spent a lot of time in California. We usually go up to California in the summer, to Northern California, the Bay Area. But at the moment, I'm in Boston. We have family here, and this year we're here. So we live in Phoenix, but Phoenix, starting about beginning of this month, is incredibly hot. And if you can, you go away. And we're lucky to be able to do that and keep working.
Nice.
So I'm here in Boston.
And so let's take a quick peek at one review, which is a lovely review for this book. I think this would give people a good sense of it. And it's by Reader's Favorite. They do a lovely job of doing reviews, and they have awards and all kinds of things. And I thought this captured it nicely. A wonderfully written, heartfelt exposition of the way in which families will often bend the truth or outright lie to protect their reputations or soften the blow of mistakes for those who follow behind. Margaret Ann Spence has touched an exposed nerve with this story. What a lovely review. I thought that captured it. And
I think that's a great review. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm fascinated on the inspiration behind this book because you clearly did a ton of research. I could tell that as I was reading it. You get into the detail of how they take care of the goats and the chickens and all of these things that I had no idea about. So like, why this? Like, where did the original inspiration, the seed of that idea of writing about like secrets from the past set on a hippie commune come from?
I think I don't know why I write mysteries about family secrets. I really don't know. They're not in my family as far as I know, but my first book was about a family secret also, and about some difficulties with family. I suppose that's the writing. You have to write about conflict, so you have to have that. As far as the farm, I guess I've always sort of been interested in that, sort of never wanted to get my hands dirty, so to speak, but I'm really fascinated by it. I grew up on stories of my grandmother who grew up in a dairy farm that failed because of a drought and all the hardships connected with that. And I also lived for many years in a little town, bucolic little town called Lincoln, Massachusetts, where a lot of farmers live. I mean, they've been farming there for 300 years. And so we were surrounded by farms and people who had sheep and goats and things like that, and chickens everywhere. And in fact, in that picture on the Instagram that you showed me of the chicken tractor, did you see that one with all the chickens around it? I mentioned the chicken tractor in the book, but that's at a place called Codman Farm. I took that photograph myself, and that's a community farm in Lincoln, Massachusetts. So all these threads came together. I know that Northern California has a lot of alternate communities as well, and that's a fascinating place.
Yeah, it's a fascinating lifestyle, and like you say, I've always been fascinated by it. And it's funny because my hubby thinks it's no big deal that he kind of grew up on a commune. He's like, no big deal, it just is. And I'm like, no, that's really interesting and fascinating to me. And I loved reading a book that got into it in more detail because he's always like, I don't know, it was just like living on a farm, no big deal.
Where did he live? Where was he from?
In Sonoma County.
Yeah.
So I wasn't quite sure where your book was set. I knew it was somewhere within
the
driving
north,
distance. A little bit further north.
Up near Ukiah.
I knew it was north of San Francisco.
Hippie country, Humboldt County.
Awesome.
It's fictional.
Awesome.
I mean, I don't. This place doesn't exist, but it's in that area.
So how did the book change during editing? And this isn't your first book, right? You had Lipstick on a Strawberry before. Yeah. And so how did it change during editing? Now that you're not doing this for the very first time, what does your editing process look like?
I edit several times before I submitted it, and I changed the title at a suggestion of an agent, actually, who I didn't hire me, or whatever the word is. She didn't want the book in the end. But my editor at Wild Rose Press was Eileen McKenzie, who was wonderful, and we did a lot of editing, but it was really just detail editing. It wasn't any structural editing at all, and it was just made it tighter. And so I would advise people to do a lot of editing before you ever go to the publisher. It really has to be pretty much ready to go, I think, in order to get a contract. And some people find that hard because, and I was like that too, you get very impatient. You know, I want to get this out there, and I know the editor will fix it, but sometimes they don't fix it the way you want. So I didn't have that problem with Eileen at all. She was absolutely wonderful. And I just feel it was, we went through 5 edits, which is a lot of proofreading too. And I think she's just very thorough and let me have those 5 because it's a lot. You know,
that's great. I thought the editing at the Wild Rose Press was great. I had the same experience that I didn't have to do a lot of story level edits, like developmental edits, in part because I'd already worked with a developmental editor. But my goodness, they caught things that I have as like writing tics that I do again and again and again that I wasn't even aware of. Like she made me take out the word to. And I was like, what's wrong with the word to, as in to go, to do something?
Yeah.
And she said, well, you need to look at how you use it. And I went and I looked, and almost every time I used that word to show instead, to tell instead of showing. So
It's
I
right.
would say
Little
something.
things like that.
Yeah.
I think it was like that too. Yeah. The word to is one of the things that it sounds, it's not a passive word actually, but it doesn't put you in the scene so much.
Yeah, like I would do things like she opened this is not a real example, but she opened the door to see what was on the other side. And she would say, you're telling, right? Because when you say to see what was on the other side, that's telling the reader instead of letting them experience it. It was like,
exactly.
Oh yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that she picked up with me too. And
did you have any little ones that came up again and again? Like that was one for me that I think I had 1,000 of them to fix. Do you have any favorites that you remember?
Well, one of the interesting things about my writing is that I'm not conscious of writing in sort of British English. I don't know if this happens to you, Lainey, but I think my editor's Scottish, and so she didn't pick up stuff either. And since someone said to me, you used the word thence, I said, really? Thence? Thence? I mean, that sounds like something out of the 16th century. And I just think like that. I didn't realize that was something that people wouldn't know.
I actually, my hubby does my de-anglophiling my books for me because I think my favorite one was it took a 5-minute conversation to disentangle conversation about how she poured herself a bath. And he's like, what, like from a pitcher? And I'm like, no, from a jug. No, not from a jug, from the tap. He means the faucet? Oh my goodness. Yeah. Because we pour a bath, literally.
We got a bath, you're right. Well, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, something like that. I mean, I still struggle with that actually all this time because it's just the way you naturally talk and write, you know.
So what advice do you give people who are earlier on the path? I loved your thought there. You said, like, take it as far as you can, make sure the story level is really solid before you take it to the publisher. Any other advice? If you could talk to, you a few years back, what would you say?
Delaney, I think the difference between being published and not being published is just persistence. And really, you have a story that you want to tell, and you have to tell it well. But if you start getting discouraged because your critique group doesn't like it or an agent doesn't like it, you can take something from that. But I think that doesn't mean the story is not good and that you shouldn't tell it. I think there are so many barriers put up in front of writers. I mean, there's so many books out there, and people say there's so many books and some of them are so terrible. Why do people write books all the time? I guess people who write books because they have to write books. I have to write books. I just have to write a story. And I think that people get discouraged all the time because it's so difficult. There are so many gatekeepers. Even if it's self-publishing, that's sort of not easy either. I can't imagine doing that. But you just have to keep going.
Yeah, I think, it is, like you say, it's difficult. The act itself of writing a good story and getting it polished and completing it is difficult by itself, right? There's so much learning and craft. And even when you've done it many times, it's a lot of work. Like it's a lot of hard work to get there and polishing and getting it right. And then there's all the rejection side of it as well, which is even if you do all that work, you have to, like you say, persevere through all these levels and tiers of rejections that happen. And so I love that. Perseverance. Stick with it. That's awesome advice.
And then the reviews, be pleased if you get a good review, but don't be upset if you got a bad review because people have different tastes, right? They just do.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I always say what you're doing when you write a review is helping someone identify whether the book is for them. You're not trying to like literary critique whether the book was of quality or not. Like that's not my job as a reader. Everybody has different tastes. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, and I want to show some of those great photos on your Instagram you were talking about, but have you read anything good recently? Any books you have to recommend or that you'd enjoyed?
Yeah, well, our fellow WFWA member, Barbara Lynn Probst, has done this marvelous book, her Queen of the Owls. And it's so original. And she's going to be talking to a book group that I'm in June, I think. It's so interesting. And I think I like books that have a really different theme. I love Julie Clark. The Last Flight was her latest book. I enjoyed that. But I really loved her first book, The Ones We Choose, which was about Have you read it? It's about a single mother who has a son through artificial insemination. And that's a really interesting topic. I mean, it's all very well for the mother to do it, but then what happens when the child wants to ask questions? And how does he feel about himself or herself? And who am I? What's my identity? Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Oh. She did a beautiful job, and she also explored the science of genetics. I don't know if she's a scientist, but I learned a lot. It was very interesting. So they're women's fictions.
That's great. And I can see why that appeals to you, because in your book and reading your book, I had that same experience of like, not only did I get taken on a journey and I read a story and it was an interesting character, but I learned a lot. And so I really came away feeling like,
I'd love to do something about more than the characters, you know, that about a topic of our time. And I suppose that's my journalistic background. But I want to talk about something beyond just an individual and his or her concerns, you know.
So let's take a peek at that Instagram account, because I think, to your point, that you are sharing things that are really interesting. That's kind of like the story behind the story on your Instagram. And just so people can find you if they're on the audio, you're Margaret_Ann_Spence, and it'll be in the show notes. But talk to us a little bit about, I see the chicken truck here, right, is one of your photos.
It's a chicken truck. Yeah. That's that's a picture that I took of the chickens in Lincoln, Massachusetts at the Codman farm. But in my book, I have a scene with one of the characters is with a chicken truck. And this allows the chickens to roam freely and kind of fertilizing the field as they go, and also eating up all the grubs. And then at night, they go into this shelter to be protected from foxes and coyotes and all that. And then they moved. They moved every day, so that each part of the field is fertilized a little bit more. And then the picture next to it is of the Berkeley, the Botanical Garden of Berkeley, and University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley Botanical Garden. It was a gorgeous view of the bay. You can see it just in the distance. I did quite a bit of research there in 2019. We were up there, and I learned a lot about plants, and some of the volunteers really talked to me. And I also took some classes there in things like cloth dyeing and the things that some of my characters do. So that was a lovely time. Yeah. And next door to that picture is the lemons from our garden. Yeah. And I don't know what this is, flowers. Oh, someone gave me some flowers. So I just
beautiful. Well, I'd encourage folks to follow you, because you're obviously posting really interesting content. And just like I learned from the book, I can learn from your Instagram. And at www.MargaretAnnSpence, if people want to find you for all your other social medias. I know you're on Facebook and everywhere else as well.
Exactly.
And I'll just say thank you for joining me and for writing such an interesting book. I really did feel like I learned a lot.
Oh, well, thank you, Lainey.